Chapter 1. The Stranger in the Snow. The wind howled across the Montana plains like a wounded beast, carrying with it needles of ice that stung the skin. Snow had been falling since sundown, smothering the earth in a thick white blanket. Inside the small log cabin at the edge of the valley, Clara Whitfield stirred the fire and pressed her shawl tighter across her shoulders. Her little boy slept soundly in the loft above, his soft breaths barely audible over the groan of the storm. She was about to latch the door for the night when she heard it. Faint at first, like the cry of a dying animal. A groan. Then another. Clara's hand froze on the latch. No one in their right mind would be out here tonight. Fear prickled her spine, but so did something else, a voice in her heart that refused to leave a soul to die in the cold. Lifting the lantern, she unbarred the door. The wind burst in, stealing her breath, and in the half-light she saw him, a man crumpled in the snow, half buried by the drifting storm. His hat lay several feet away, his coat torn and rimmed with ice. Good Lord! Clara dropped to her knees, lantern trembling in her grip. The stranger's eyes fluttered open, dark, fierce, yet dull by fever. Help! His voice was hoarse, the word stolen almost as soon as it left his lips. Clara hesitated only a moment before sliding her arms under his shoulders. He was heavy, far heavier than her slender frame could bear, but desperation lent her strength. With gritted teeth she dragged him inside, the door slamming shut behind them with a thud that shook the cabin. The fire's glow cast his features into sharp relief. A strong jaw dusted with stubble, cheekbones cut hard as stone, lips blue with cold. Clara worked quickly, stripping away his soaked coat and boots, muttering half to herself, "You'll not die under my roof, stranger. Not tonight." He stirred, his gaze flicking toward her, though his eyelids sagged heavy. Didn't mean to trouble. Trouble? She snorted softly, laying a quilt over him. It's trouble enough trying to keep myself and a child alive. Another mouth to feed won't kill me, not yet anyhow. He managed a ghost of a smile before slipping into unconsciousness. Clara sat back on her heels, studying him. Something about him didn't fit the image of a simple drifter. His hands bore the calluses of hard work, but the cut of his clothes, fine wool beneath the frost, spoke of someone who'd once had more than dust and trail grime to his name. A coyote's cry rose in the distance, long and lonesome. Clara looked toward the window, snow piling high against the glass. She sighed, tucking the quilt tighter around him. "Whoever you are," she whispered, voice soft as a fire's crackle, "the Lord seemed fit to drop you on my doorstep. Let's see if you're worth the saving." Outside, the storm raged on, but inside, two lives had just crossed paths in a way that neither could yet understand. Chapter 2. Secrets by the Hearth. By morning, the storm had quieted. The wind still rattled against the shutters, but the worst had passed, leaving the world outside buried in white silence. Inside the cabin, Clara knelt by the hearth, coaxing the flames high while the smell of coffee and cornmeal porridge filled the room. She kept glancing toward the cot where the stranger lay, his breath now steadier, his color returned enough that he looked less like death's shadow. When his eyes finally opened, they were sharp and restless, like a hawk's. Clara, catching the look, set her ladle down and spoke evenly. "Figured you'd wake sooner or later. Best sit up and eat while it's hot." He shifted, grimacing as stiff muscles protested. "Didn't mean to land on your doorstep, ma'am." Clara brought him the steaming bowl, her brow furrowed. "Out here in winter, folk don't last long if they fall in the snow. You've no call to apologize for breathing." He took the spoon, his hand trembling, but pride steadied it before she could notice too much. He ate in silence, though his gaze flicked around the room. The hand-carved table, the Bible on the shelf, the pair of tiny boots drying by the fire. "You've a child," he said after a long pause. Clara's shoulder stiffened. A son. He's sleeping still, and he's none of your concern. The stranger inclined his head, not pressing further. He studied her, though, with the kind of watchfulness that made her uneasy. His clothes had thawed by the fire, and she saw now that beneath the trailed dust and torn seams, the fabric was finer than what most drifters wore. "What do they call you?" she asked at last, her voice cautious. He hesitated, as though weighing the truth. "James. Just James." Clara arched a brow. "Just James, is it? Well, James, I'd wager you've known more than a day's worth of hard work. Your hands give you away. But those boots of yours," she gestured with her chin, "cost more than my whole cabin." His mouth tugged into a crooked smile. "Maybe I bought 'em second-hand off a gambler who lost at cards." "Maybe," she said, though suspicion lingered in her tone. Silence settled between them, broken only by the crackle of the fire. He finished his porridge, setting the bowl aside with care. "I owe you my life," he said at last, his voice softer now. "You owe me nothing," Clara replied, standing and pulling her shawl close. "The Lord doesn't measure kindness in debts. But don't mistake this for charity. I've a child to protect. Any trouble follows you. You'll be out that door as quick as I found you." James leaned back against the quilt, his dark eyes following her every move. He didn't argue, didn't promise, but in the curve of his smile and in the way he watched her, Clara sensed both secrets and storms waiting to come. Outside, the snow gleamed under a weak sun. Inside, the air between them warmed with something more dangerous than fire. Unspoken trust, and the beginnings of a bond neither dared name. Chapter 3. Whispers in Town. The snow melted into slush by the week's end, leaving the prairie damp and muddy under the pale sun. Clara hitched her mule to the wagon, her son bundled beneath blankets, and steered toward town. She needed flour, coffee, and salt, supplies stretched thin by the storm. James insisted on riding along, claiming the walk would put strength back in his legs. He wore a borrowed coat from Clara's late husband. It seemed tight across his broad shoulders, but his stride had the easy confidence of a man used to being obeyed by horses and men alike. Clara said nothing, though she felt the weight of his presence like a shadow at her side. By the time they reached the small town of Dry Creek, the muddy streets were alive with the clang of hammers, wagons rattling past, and the babble spilling from the saloon. Men tipped their hats at Clara, some polite, some with grins that lingered too long. A few women muttered behind their gloves, whispers sharp as needles. "There she is," one voice carried. "The widow Whitfield, dragging a new man into town already." Clara's jaw tightened. She kept her chin high, though the words pricked her like thorns. James's gaze shifted, noting the whispers, his jaw set like granite. They stepped into the mercantile, its wooden floor creaking under their boots. Clara gathered what she needed, her son tugging at her skirts. When the door swung open behind them, a group of ranch hands swaggered in, dust on their hats, spurs jangling. "Well, if it ain't little Clara Whitfield," one drawled, leaning against the counter. "Didn't waste no time replacing that husband of yours." Clara froze, the paper flower crinkling in her grip. Heat rose to her cheeks, shame warring with fury. Before she could speak, James stepped forward. "Mind your tongue," he said, voice calm, low, but carrying the weight of a thundercloud. The ranch hand smirked, sizing him up. "And who might you be? Looks to me like you're nothing but a drifter taking shelter where you can." James's hand hovered near his hip, fingers brushing the worn leather of his gun belt. The room stilled. Even the shopkeeper paused, eyes darting nervously. "You're welcome to your whiskey talk at the saloon," James said evenly. "But you'll keep a civil tongue when you speak to a lady, or you'll answer to me." The silence stretched taut as a drawn rope. Then the ranch hand spat to the side, muttered something foul under his breath, and slunk back toward the door. His companions followed, grumbling. Clara let out the breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. James turned to her, his dark eyes searching hers. "You didn't have to," she began. "Yes," he interrupted, his voice softer now. "I did." Outside, the saloon piano struck a lively tune, laughter spilling into the street. But Clara knew that in one heated moment, James had revealed a piece of himself, dangerous, protective, and far from ordinary, and she couldn't decide whether it frightened her or drew her closer. Chapter 4, Shadows of the Past. The prairie at dusk wore a bloody hue, the sinking sun stretching shadows long across Clara's homestead. The air smelled of sage and wood smoke, yet beneath it lingered something sour, danger close at hand. Clara felt it before she heard it, the faint rhythm of hooves carried on the wind, too many for neighbors, too quiet for honest folk. James stood by the corral, mending a rail with sleeves rolled to his elbows. His head lifted, his body still as stone. Clara followed his gaze toward the horizon, where dust rose against the fire-colored sky. "They're not coming to trade," James said, voice flat. Clara's heart hammered. "Bandits." He didn't answer, but his hand went to the Colt at his hip. A muscle ticked in his jaw. "Get your boy inside. Bar the door." She wanted to argue, but the steel in his tone brooked no protest. Scooping her son from the yard, she hurried inside, bolting the door with trembling fingers. Through the slats she saw them. 5 men, rough-faced, rifles slung loose, circling like wolves. The leader spat into the dirt. "Heard, tell the widow Whitfield's harboring a man with money. Best hand him over, sweetheart, and we'll be on our way." Clara gripped her son close, breath ragged. James stepped forward into the dying light, his silhouette sharp against the horizon. He didn't deny it, didn't flinch. Instead, he lifted his voice, calm as still water. "You'll find no easy prey here. Turn back while you can." The men laughed, cruel and eager. One raised his rifle. In a heartbeat, James's gun cleared leather. The crack split the air, echoing across the valley. The man's hat flew from his head, the bullet close enough to tear cloth, but not flesh. Silence fell like a dropped veil. "You'll get your warning once," James said, eyes cold as flint. The leader cursed, motioning to his men. But before they could move, a new thunder rose. Hooves again, but this time from the north ridge. A dozen riders burst into view, rifles glinting. Clara's breath caught. They weren't bandits. They rode straight and sure, their coats bearing the brands of Montana's largest ranch. James lowered his weapon, the faintest smile ghosting his lips. "I reckon you boys didn't know who you were dealing with." The bandits paled, spurred their horses, and vanished into the dusk. Clara stumbled outside, her son clutching her skirts. "Those men," she began, her voice unsteady. "They work for me," James said quietly, eyes never leaving hers. "For you?" He stepped closer, the fire of the sunset painting him in gold and crimson. "I wasn't lying when I gave you my name, but I didn't tell you the rest. James Callahan. I own every ranch you can see from here to the mountains." Clara's breath hitched. Hurt and disbelief tangled in her chest. He had hidden himself, let her treat him like a drifter, when all along he carried more power than she could fathom. "Why lie?" she whispered, voice tight. His hand hovered as though he might touch her cheek, but he stopped short. "Because I needed someone to see me as a man, not just as land and cattle. And you did." The coyotes cried in the distance, sharp and mournful, as Clara stood torn between betrayal and the undeniable truth that her heart already leaned toward him. Chapter 5, Hearts Laid Bare. The storm of gunfire and hoofbeats had long faded, but Clara's heart still pounded as if the bandits circled her home. She paced the cabin floor, lantern light flickering across her taut face, while James stood near the hearth silent, his broad shoulders casting shadows on the wall. She turned sharply, skirt swishing. "You should have told me." Her voice cracked, raw from fear and fury. "All this time, letting me believe you were some wanderer with nothing but trail dust to his name." James's jaw tightened. He looked older now, wearier, like the weight of 100 ranches pressed down on him. "Clara, if I had told you who I was the moment you dragged me from that snowbank, would you have trusted me? Or would you have barred your door, fearing the kind of man who owns half the territory?" Her hands clenched the edge of the table until her knuckles blanched. "I don't fear men with land. I fear men with secrets." The words hit him harder than a bullet. He took a step closer, boots creaking on the wooden planks. "I've spent years surrounded by people who smile at my money and bow to my name. I needed someone to see me plain. You did, and it shook me more than any outlaw's bullet." Clara turned away, fighting the sting in her eyes. She thought of her son asleep upstairs, of the lonely years spent fighting for scraps and dignity in a town that whispered behind her back. She wanted to hate him for his deception. Yet when she remembered how he had stood in the snow, defiant against 5 armed men, her heart betrayed her resolve. "You think words will mend this?" she asked, her voice low. "No," James answered. His voice was rough, stripped bare. "But maybe truth will. Clara, when I lay in your cabin half dead, it wasn't the fire that kept me alive. It was you, your strength, your kindness. I've lived with more wealth than I ever needed, but not once did I feel rich until I met you." Silence fell heavy. Clara slowly turned, her eyes meeting his. The lantern light caught the lines of his face, every scar, every crease carved by a life of power and solitude. He looked at her as though she were the only soul left in Montana. Her breath shuddered out, and her anger softened, replaced by something more dangerous. Longing. "If you want my trust," she whispered, "you'll have to earn it. Not with money, not with ranches, with honesty." James's chest rose and fell. He stepped close enough that she felt the heat of him, his voice a vow against the quiet. "Then honesty you'll have for as long as I draw breath." The world outside was silent. The prairie bathed in silver moonlight. Inside, Clara lifted her chin, her eyes searching his one last time before surrendering to the truth in her heart. Their lips met, hesitant at first, then fierce, sealing the promise of a love forged not in wealth or pretense, but in fire and storm. Chapter 6. A Home for Two and One More. Spring came slow to Montana, the snow retreating inch by inch, replaced by green shoots stubborn enough to pierce the thawing earth. Clara stood on her porch one morning, her shawl wrapped around her shoulders, watching the valley awaken beneath a sky brushed in pink and gold. Her son darted through the grass, chasing a puppy James had brought weeks before, their laughter carrying on the cool air. Behind her, hammers rang. James and 2 of his ranch hands worked side by side, raising sturdy new timbers for her homestead. Where once the roof had sagged and the walls leaned, now strong beams stretched high, ready to stand against any storm. James drove the last nail, sweat glinting on his brow, and when his eyes met Clara's, something warm and unspoken passed between them. He joined her on the porch, boots heavy on the planks, his shadow falling across her. "House will hold through any blizzard now," he said, voice steady. But that was never the real point. Clara tilted her chin, searching his face. And what was the point? He took off his hat, running a hand through his dark hair before looking at her with a nakedness she had come to recognize. The truth, stripped of pretense. That a house is only boards and nails. A home, that's built with trust, with love. Her breath caught. She thought of the long night she'd sat alone, of the judgmental stares in town, of the bitter winters where loneliness pressed as heavy as snowdrifts. And now, here stood a man who'd ridden through storms, who'd faced down bandits, who could have lived anywhere yet chose to stand with her in the dust of her hard-won land. "James," she hesitated, but the word came out soft, trembling. "You've given me more than I ever dared hope for, not because of who you are, but because you see me and my boy, as worth standing beside." His gaze softened, and for a long moment he said nothing. Then he reached for her hand, rough and callous against her own. "I told you once I'd be honest with you. So here it is plain. I love you, Clara Whitfield. And if you'll let me, I'll spend the rest of my days proving it." Her throat tightened, tears brimming as she whispered, "Then prove it by staying, not as the man who owns Montana, but as the man who made me believe in tomorrow again." James's smile was quiet but fierce. He bent, pressing his lips to hers, sealing the vow not with wealth, but with a fire of devotion. From a yard, her son's laughter rang out, the puppy barking in joy. Clara broke the kiss, looking toward the sound, her heart full. A family not broken, but rebuilt, stronger than before. James wrapped an arm around her shoulders, pulling her close as the sun climbed higher, casting light over the ranches, the valley, and the future stretched before them. Together they watched the horizon, where love and land met under the endless Montana sky. The Montana sky burned with the last light of day, streaks of crimson and gold fading into indigo. Clara stood on the ridge beside James, the wind carrying the scent of sagebrush and the faint strains of fiddle drifting from the saloon in town below. Her son laughed in the yard behind them, chasing the puppy through tall grass that swayed like waves under the sunset. It had been months since that night in the storm, months since she dragged a stranger from the snow. He was no longer a mystery, no longer just a man half frozen on her porch. He was James Callahan, the rancher who had faced down bandits, rebuilt her home, and more than all else, chosen her over the vast empire he commanded. James reached for her hand, rough palm against hers. "Clara," he said, voice low and steady, "I've owned land, cattle, and more gold than I needed, but not until you did I ever own a reason to stay." Her throat tightened, tears shining in her eyes as she whispered back, "And I never believed I'd love again. But here you are, my proof that storms can bring blessings." He drew her close, pressing his forehead to hers as the sun dipped beneath the horizon. Behind them, hoofbeats echoed faintly across the plains, steady as a heartbeat, carrying the promise of tomorrow. Together they stood, widow, rancher, child, no longer broken pieces, but a family bound beneath the endless Montana sky.